Today we have Nayda Kelly, who is a recent volunteer at the museum. Welcome volunteer. After retiring from her career in Melbourne's advertising industry, Nayda, who describes herself as a person who loves something to do, started researching her family history as a hobby. Her grandfather had worked for 30 years on the PS Weeroona, the last of the Port Phillip paddle steamers to be built, and Nayda had always been fascinated in this period of history. And then came COVID, which for Nayda was a catalyst for taking this interest to the next level and completing an online diploma of family history course at the University of Tasmania. Now Nayda and her husband Brian are enjoying their sea change. They moved to Point Lonsdale about 18 months ago, allowing them to be closer to the family and enjoying the seaside. As I said, Nayda is now a very valued member of the research team at the museum, and I welcome Nayda to present.
Thank you to Robert and Judy Idle. If you haven't already seen it, that magnificent photograph up on the wall near the tea table is the Ozone. She was the first of the 3 big paddle steamers that plied up and down Port Phillip. And to me, that is just a magnificent photo. If you haven't seen it, at the end of the presentation, please go and have a look before Robert steals it back and takes it to his house before I steal it and take it to mine. Anyway, good morning and thank you, Mary Lou. My presentation has actually evolved from research undertaken for assignments during the Family History University course. The facts we uncover during research of our ancestors can be the pathway to colourful stories, not only about them, but the times they lived in. Today, I would like to share one of these stories with you, the story of the Bay Excursion paddle steamers. This is a social history story of our past, a time when the journey to a destination was an exciting part of the total experience. I will cover the heyday of these elegant vessels from the late 1880s until the Second World War. In particular, I will concentrate on these 3 ships in this beautiful painting from the Port Melbourne Historical and Preservation Society's collection. The Ozone, the Hygeia, and my personal favourite, the Weeroona. I will also talk about the coastal towns they visited, what happened during the voyages, and what it meant to be a bay excursionist. On the 27th of November 1910, the paddle steamer Weeroona paddled into Port Phillip and then into the murky brown waters of the Yarra River to her berth at North Wharf. I'm sure the Yarra River was pretty murky way back then. This magnificent ship was on the last leg of her 66 days delivery voyage from Glasgow, Scotland, to join the popular bay excursion trade. Her cabins and decks were boarded up for protection from the turbulent seas she would encounter on the voyage. On board was my paternal grandfather, Jimmy McLaughlin, a greaser working in the engine room. Now remember that, engine room. Jimmy was an Irishman from a small farming village in Donegal who had moved to Greenock in Scotland. The Glasgow-Greenock area was the hub of the UK shipbuilding industry. Even an Irishman could find a job in the shipyards. By 1906, he was widowed, sadly, with 2 children, a son and a daughter, and still working in the shipyards. Then in 1909, the Glasgow shipbuilder A&J Inglis received an order to build what would be the largest paddle steamer on Port Phillip. She was to be named the Weeroona after a small creek near Sorrento. This is a photo of the actual shipyard where the Weeroona was built. My grandfather was actually one of the yard crew who built the paddle steamer. So he not only came out on it, he helped build her. And when she set sail for Melbourne, he was one of the crew of 33. Jimmy's 2 children went to Ireland to live with his parents when he left. He never went back to Ireland. He stayed in Melbourne, married my grandmother, and the rest, as they say, is history. However, this is only the family part of his story. The rest of the story is inexorably linked to the Weeroona. For the next 30 years, he continued to work on board in the engine room, again, remember it, greasing parts and stoking the coal fires to keep her paddles turning until shortly before his death. It's actually one of my uni assignments. It's a map I drew for one of those. But it's my artistic version of the voyage. And I hope it gives you some understanding of what it was like. I mean, that's a long, long trip. She paddled over 14,400 nautical miles from Greenock to Melbourne, and her only stops were for supplies and coal. It was no pleasure cruise. Gibraltar, Port Said, Aden, Colombo, Batavia, Surabaya, and after 44 days, she finally arrived in the Torres Strait. Then down the east coast, Townsville, Sydney, into the Rip, and across Port Phillip to join the other two bay excursion steamers. That's a beautiful photograph of her. The paddle steamers of Port Phillip were all of a similar construction. They were relatively flat-bottomed ships with paddles which churned through the water for momentum instead of propellers. These ships had side paddles, which were considered ideal for the very shallow waters of Port Phillip. There's actually a scale model of the Weeroona at the Queenscliffe Maritime Museum, well worth having a look at. Prior to 1868, travel around the bay meant boarding vessels with little comfort or shelter for passengers, such as tugs, small schooners and steamers, or even little ferries. The first excursion trips began with the arrival of the Mystery in 1868. However, she offered little amenities for her passengers, and 6 years later, she left for Sydney. In 1872, the Williams came to the bay. She was 3 times larger than the Mystery. She could carry 600 passengers. She had a covered promenade deck for dancing, an enclosed saloon and on-board catering. In 1885, facing competition from larger vessels, she was sold and left Port Phillip. With the bay excursion trade flourishing in the mid-1870s and coastal towns booming, the Sorrento and Queenscliffe Steam Navigation Company brought the Golden Crown from New Zealand. She began regular bay excursions in December 1874. Although on the small side, she was an impressive ship with lavish fittings and carried around 300 passengers, so substantially smaller. Then in 1883, the paddle steamer Lonsdale came into service. She'd been built in the shipyards of Glasgow, specifically for the Port Phillip excursion service, and in addition to her steam engine to drive her paddles, was rigged as a 3-masted schooner for the voyage to Australia via the Suez Canal. These 4 early paddle steamers introduced the people of Victoria to the pleasure of travelling on board bay excursion paddle steamers. They were followed by the arrival of the Ozone in 1886, the Hygeia in 1890, and then, of course, the Weeroona in 1910, the largest and most palatial. The Ozone, there are her stats. The first of the 3, she was built in 1886 in Glasgow. She had 3 decks, a dining saloon, separate lounges for ladies and gentlemen, a smoking room, a bar, and a dance floor. Her interiors featured carved woodwork panelling, plush seating, and her sheltered decks provided comfort for all. She took the word luxury to a new level in paddle steamers, including electric lighting throughout. Remember, 1886, and she was fully rigged with electric lighting throughout. Her first trip was on 18th of December 1886. A successful trip with 300 passengers, guests, and of course a band. And only one trifling incident, she hit the Queenscliffe pier as she was berthing. There was little damage to either the pier or the Ozone, and she disembarked her passengers and paddled on to Sorrento. Then in 1890, competition arrived. the Hygeia. She was named after the Greek goddess of health. She was also built in Glasgow for Melbourne-based shipping company Hygeia Parker. She was larger and her fittings even more luxurious. She was capable of 22 knots under full steam. And to put that into perspective, a cruise ship today averages 20 knots on a voyage. So 22 knots was really hooning down the bay. As the Hygeia set off on her first trip in December 1990, from Port Melbourne Railway Pier, the sky became overcast and a thunderstorm sent guests scurrying into her plush saloons. The storm passed quickly and sunny skies greeted her arrival in Queenscliffe. Then in November 1910, the Weeroona arrived. Again, Glasgow built for Heyday Parker. She had not one but two dining saloons, which were cooled by an innovative system designed to cope with the tropical conditions she would be sailing in. Or so it was reported in the London Times. I'm not sure quite where they'd get tropical from, but she certainly had it all. She was larger than the Hygeia, and her licence capacity was 1,927 to be precise. On the 17th of December 1910, she paddled down the bay to Queenscliffe, Sorrento and Dramana. Every pier was crowded with cheering locals. For more than 50 years, bay excursionists boarded these three luxurious ships. They were holiday makers, day trippers, and often on a charter, such as trade picnics. This map actually shows the various routes, a bit hard to see, but they certainly plied up and down the bay for many, many years. These constant bay excursions contributed significantly to the development of the coastal towns they visited. Love that sketch. Many passengers boarded these paddle steamers to reach their destinations like a ferry service, just A to B. However, it was much more than that. While on board, they enjoyed dining, dancing, bands, high tea, palatial lounges, card games, bars, ladies' lounges, really had everything. Rumours have it that many a romance began on a paddle steamer excursion, and I actually have a friend whose parents did meet on one of those. Definitely not a ferry service. To quote from the words of a mother, how she and her family enjoyed a typical day excursion on a paddle steamer in the 1890s. Her exceptionally descriptive story, written 40 years later, appeared in the Argus. And in case you've forgotten, it was a morning newspaper here in Melbourne in August 1940. Her day started at 6 a.m. as there were picnic baskets to pack and children to dress. Now I want ladies in particular, close your eyes, start thinking about it. I can still see the dresses we mothers wore, white muslin, fresh and starchy, sleeves standing out and a high net collar, and a large hat tied on with a gossamer veil. At last, Port Melbourne, there waiting for us, the Ozone. The children would be lagging behind by this time, and my voluminous skirt would not be quite so fresh. But the sight and smell of that boat and everything set everything right again. Dear old Ozone. She wrote of searching for lost children on board, into the saloon with the red plush seats and a golden-haired lady playing on a tinny piano. Our lunch on the beach comes back to my mind as a nightmare of heat, flies and sand. But we loved it, sand, heat and all. Our swim was the feature of the day. How eagerly we watched for the ladies' white flag over the bars. Our husbands, having had their swim while the red flag flew, would be on duty while we had ours. She then went on to describe the return trip. By this time, the fathers would be showing signs of wear, and our white frocks were not so white. Little sticky fingers all day. Yick! Then the wind veered round to the south. Only a mother down the bay with her family can really know what havoc that causes. The children get seasick. We all feel very ill, except, of course, our husbands. Personally, I didn't care anymore about my white muslin dress. I was beginning to wish it was a shroud. There isn't time for me to read her entire story, but I hope that using some of her words has given you an appreciation of how families enjoyed their time on board and their day at the towns they visited, and what it meant to be a bay excursionist. The bay excursion season began round about Cup Day, early November, until Easter the next year. This photo shows masses of passengers disembarking at Queenscliffe Pier. I don't know if you've ever really thought about how many people these ships carried, but that gives you a pretty good idea. Between the 3 paddle steamers, they could carry more than 3,000 passengers to the resort towns in just one day. Wouldn't the restaurants, cafes and ice cream bars of today love that? The exponential growth of the towns around the bay from the mid-1860s led to an increased demand for more and improved transportation. As these seaside towns flourished, so did the bay excursion paddle steamer service. Let's look at Queenscliffe and Sorrento, 2 of the most popular seaside resort towns then and today. Queenscliffe, originally known as Shortlands Bluff, is the home of the pilot service, which began in 1839. So Queenscliffe has a wonderful long history. By the 1860s, many of the historic buildings we see today had been completed. The impressive Queenscliffe Fort was constructed over a 25-year period beginning in 1861. And then with the opening of the Geelong to Queenscliffe Railway in 1879, the area became even more popular. However, from Melbourne, it was a long overland journey by a combination of trains via Geelong, then train or bone-rattling coach ride, taking around 3 hours or more. But not on a bay excursion paddle steamer. You could board one of these and paddle down the bay in comfort and luxury in as little as 1 3/4 hours. No comparison. The seaside towns of Point Lonsdale and Queenscliffe were popular with not only prosperous Melburnians, but also with wealthy tourists from Ballarat, Bendigo and the Western District. And of course, politicians. Charles La Trobe, first superintendent of the colony, had a cottage in Queenscliffe in 1844. Was he the first tourist? 1844. And Australia's second Prime Minister, Alfred Deakin, had a holiday home in Point Lonsdale, which is actually still there today. And the hot sea baths near the Queenscliffe Pier also drew huge crowds to the area. The baths rivaled those in Melbourne as they were close to clean ocean currents, not near the polluted river and sewer outlets of the city baths. Queenscliffe and Point Lonsdale were inundated annually each summer by tourists utilising these floating palace paddle steamers. A bit like today, but they come in cars, but we certainly get inundated every summer. Wealthy Melburnians began building holiday houses in Sorrento in the 1860s, and it was George Coppin, MP, actor and entrepreneur, who saw its potential as a holiday resort. Travel to this area was difficult and tedious. Ferries, small steamers, tugs, or of course by coach. There was no rail service to Sorrento then, and still isn't today. With the purchase of the Golden Crown by George's company, the return ticket price was reduced from 20 shillings on the Williams to 7 shillings and 6pence. Small fortune. His companies were also responsible for building the renowned Continental Hotel, the Ocean Beach Road to the Back Beach, and the superb steam tram. Did you know there was a tram in Sorrento? Anyone? I didn't until I did my research. There is no doubt in my mind that the paddle steamer services to these seaside towns facilitated the popularity and growth of the towns as we know them today. Throughout the excursion season, there were annual trade and employer picnic charters. These were family affairs, much anticipated by the children. A typical charter would take the passengers to one of the coastal towns where they would enjoy their picnic lunches, maybe have a swim like our other lady, play cricket, football, listen to the bands playing in the rotundas, and join in the arranged sporting activities. I love the little fella on the right. He's just gorgeous. These next couple of slides we'll flip through. There's just what people did at these trade picnics. Sort of the white muslin dress springs back to mind when I look at the front one. Fancy trying to run in that sort of outfit. So, bit of fun for all. Perhaps there wasn't as much dancing on the return trip to Port Melbourne after all that running around, and it's not a cigar or a pipe, it's the egg and spoon race. There were also moonlight excursions. They sailed from Railway Pier, later rebuilt as Station Pier, and paddled towards Brighton and Sandringham before returning to the pier, with dining and bands on board for entertainment. A delightful way to spend a warm summer's evening. Both the state and federal governments chartered the paddle steamers to meet royalty as they sailed into Port Phillip. On the 6th of May 1901, the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York boarded the Hygeia at Railway Pier and paddled to St Kilda Pier for their official welcome. The Duke, of course, was here for the opening of Australia's first federal parliament. And 19 years later, both the Hygeia and Weeroona were chartered for official duties during the royal visits in May 1920, and then they were again in 1927. And then there were charity charters. At times, the excursion boat owners donated the use of a paddle steamer for worthy causes, such as the annual trips for Port Melbourne unemployed, which began during the Great Depression. And during World War I, returned soldiers were also conveyed free on designated voyages. At other times, the charters would be used as fundraisers. Among these were annual trips to Queenscliffe for the Santa Casa Seaside Rest Home for poor children in delicate health, and for the children's holiday home, Cottage by the Sea. The list is long, as the owners of these beautiful ships at times gave back in kind to their bay excursionists and thus ensured their cherished places in the communities they served. The heyday of these excursion trips began in the late 1880s with the arrival of the Ozone until about 1918, 30 years or so. Their popularity over these years was enhanced by the lack of good alternative transport. Very few cars on the road. We're talking pre-1900 into about 1918. Even the RACV, at that time actually only the Automobile Club of Victoria, wasn't formed until 1903. Then reducing ticket costs also provided working class people the opportunity to get away from the city. By 1895, a return trip on the Ozone was down to only 3 shillings, a far cry from the 20 shillings on the Williams just 20 years earlier. Advertising also had an influence on their popularity. Have a carefree day out or a holiday by the seaside. I was amazed at the amount of advertising at that time promoting the benefits of fresh sea air away from the city's pollution. Whether you could afford it or not was another question completely. And don't forget, Port Melbourne to Queenscliffe by paddle steamer was less than 2 hours. Need I say more? So with more leisure time available with the introduction of the 8 hours working day and a half day off on Saturday, why not get dressed up? Board your favourite paddle steamer, enjoy the music and the beach, and spend time at your much-loved resort town with family and friends. The words of Captain Gray, the last master of the Weeroona, encapsulate what a day on board a paddle steamer was all about. When I look back on the good old days, when you could enjoy a full day on Port Phillip Bay for now 2 and 6pence, so we've gone down again, from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. and breathe the tangy salt air. When you could move around with freedom of movement, enjoy dancing, music and every convenience on board and meet plenty of good friends. So that's from the man himself. By 1912, with the 3 paddle steamers sailing daily to the Bellarine and Mornington peninsulas during the season, they'd reached the peak of their popularity. However, that same year, the outcry and inquiries that followed the sinking of the Titanic, with the horrendous loss of more than 1,500 lives, led to new safety regulations in the shipbuilding industry. What impact, if any, would this have on our beloved bay excursion paddle steamers? You've seen the photos, there they are, of these 3 vessels, and heard the number of passengers they carried. I'm sure it will surprise you to hear that the maritime regulations at that time stipulated they should carry 2 lifeboats in case of an emergency. Yep, that's right, only 2, and at least 4 lifebuoys. Big help they'd be. Of course, the regulations also stated that each ship should have sufficient floating apparatus for every passenger on board. But that's a rather loose expression when you realise that in 1912, 2 children were only counted as 1 passenger. And these ships carried many children. One newspaper report I found said that there were 500 children on board in one trip, but that's actually only 250 passengers according to the regulations. Could these ships cope with a maritime disaster with such minimal life-saving equipment requirements? In response to the Titanic disaster, in August 1912, the Victorian government convened a royal commission into, take a big breath, Nayda, the sufficiency or otherwise of life-saving equipment on vessels carrying passengers on rivers, lakes or landlocked waters within the state of Victoria. After hearing 3 months of evidence and deliberating for many more, the commission reported to the government multiple recommendations, among them that 2 children no longer be counted as 1 passenger, but as 2, finally. The current design of the existing or any future paddle steamer vessels cannot be altered due to the shallow waters at the Queenscliffe and Sorrento piers. No requirement for additional lifeboats. At least 1 life jacket for each individual as the vessel is licensed to carry. At least a life jacket's a bit better than clinging to a plank or a seat, which was the floating apparatus that they used to use. And so on, after due and considerable consideration, of course. Bureaucrats love to have due and considerable consideration. There were many more, but they're the most relevant. Fortunately, there never was a major incident requiring the use of life-saving equipment throughout their years of service. However, by 1918, things were becoming tougher for the paddle steamers. The effects of 4 years of World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, increasing unemployment, and the ever-growing usage of cars meant there was not enough patronage for 3 big excursion paddle steamers. The Ozone was withdrawn from service that year. She was scuttled 50 metres offshore near Indented Head, just a short drive from here, and I'm sure many of you have seen the wreck, to form a breakwater in October 1925. Today, her artificial reef is a popular dive site. During the 1920s, both the Hygeia and the Weeroona continued to paddle their way back and forth. Then in 1929, Wall Street crashed and Victoria joined the rest of the world in the Great Depression. Passenger numbers plummeted to less than half those of the heydays. At the end of the 1930-31 season, the Hygeia was also withdrawn from service. Then in August 1931, after being stripped of all her fittings and virtually only an empty hull, as she was being towed out to be sunk outside the Heads, she broke away from the tug and ran ashore near Rosebud, where she remained fast for 10 months. Finally, after much debate about her future, if any, she was refloated, towed out to the ship's graveyard in Bass Strait and sunk, thereby dispelling the superstition that she would never leave the bay where she had paddled for more than 40 years. To honour this once elegant ship, she had been fitted fore and aft with her flags, so that she went down with her colours flying. You can actually see the little flag on that one. During the Bay excursion of 1931-32, the Weeroona continued on, but with ever diminishing patronage, as cars became increasingly popular for day trips and holidays. It is estimated that the number of cars in Victoria had doubled from around 50,000 in 1921 to 100,000 just 10 years later. However, charters were still popular, and the service to Queenscliffe and Sorrento was still utilised by those who preferred to sail down the bay. So the Weeroona just kept paddling throughout each summer. Then in September 1939, Australia went to war. The Weeroona sailed her last run down the bay on the 2nd of March 1942. During her 33 bay seasons, over 3 million passengers had enjoyed her luxurious amenities, and she'd paddled more than 206,000 nautical miles. She was truly a remarkable ship. And remember, for a lot of that time, my grandfather was on board. But she was not finished yet. Unlike her predecessors, she was not destined for a watery grave. The Weeroona went to war. She transported soldiers to Queenscliffe for training, and then in 1943 was taken over by the US Navy as part of their small ship section. She paddled her way north to Sydney, where she became the USS Weeroona. Now, I have a little thing here, which I'm happy to show you individually. It's actually from the Queenscliffe Maritime Museum. It is the USS Weeroona, a door key tag. They've loaned it to me for the day. So she really did. She really became, instead of the old paddle steamer Weeroona, the USS Weeroona. Quite remarkable. Most of her crew was volunteer Australian seamen. Later, under tow, she continued north as far as Manila, where she was transferred to the US Army, serving as an accommodation and convalescent ship. And at the end of the war, she was towed back to Sydney, where she languished for 5 years before being sold, stripped of her fittings, and she was sunk off Berry Bay in Sydney Harbour. It's over 80 years since the last excursion on the Weeroona. Our journeys to or from the Bellarine and Mornington peninsulas no longer have the ambience and romance of a paddle steamer. Just congested roads, traffic jams, and what seems like never-ending roadworks. Progress, they call it. Personally, I yearn for the sound of the paddles splashing through the waves and the sea air. Before we leave the story of these magnificent ships, their voyages were not always without incident. There are a few of my favourites that I'd like to share with you. "Don't start the engines! There is a woman under the paddles," was shouted from the pier. Several hundred would-be passengers had been left on the pier as the charter that day was overbooked. A group of men and women decided to jump onto the paddle platform as the Weeroona pulled away from the pier. With the exception of one woman, all made it safely, but she fell into the water directly below the paddles. Fortunately, she was hauled aboard before the engines were started. Dripping wet, she and the rest of her group continued on the trip. So they got to do the trip. This story made the papers throughout Australia in February 1918. The claim to be the fastest steamer on Port Phillip resulted in a race in 1888 between the Ozone and the propeller-driven steamship, the Courier. The Courier had beaten the Ozone on 2 occasions. Not wanting to yield the title, the Ozone was put into dry dock. Her engines were overhauled and marine growth was scraped from her bottom. The resulting race, frowned on by authorities, was won by the Ozone and earned her the nickname the Greyhound of Port Phillip. Storms, of course, unleashed their fury on many a bay excursion. One such storm on Christmas Day 1911 began with brilliant sunshine as the undoubtedly excited families boarded the Hygeia and the Weeroona at Port Melbourne. However, this was a Christmas day to be remembered not for the pleasure of the voyage, but for the storm that battered the steamers halfway down the bay. The Hygeia shipped considerable quantities of water, and mal de mer afflicted many on board both vessels. Greeted by sunshine at Queenscliffe, many passengers disembarked in sea spray saturated attire, looking very bedraggled. The white muslin dress wouldn't have held up too well. On a sunny autumn morning in March 1924, a squadron of British Navy ships sailed into Port Phillip. This story actually is more for the men in the group. The Weeroona, with federal politicians and guests on board, paddled out to greet them. The Weeroona passed between 5 light cruisers in the fleet, and then as she approached the battle cruisers, the Hood and the Repulse. The band on board struck up Rule Britannia to the rousing cheers of all. 2 seaplanes, followed by a fleet of 12 aeroplanes, appeared and manoeuvred over the squadron. The Hygeia and many other yachts and boats also joined the flotilla as they sailed towards Melbourne. That must have been quite a sight. "I'll soon get it," cried the man whose hat had blown into the water as he disembarked from the Hygeia at Queenscliffe. He jumped into the water fully clothed and was soon seen to be in difficulty. Responding to the shrieks and shouting, Frank Beaurepaire, Australia's champion swimmer, who'd also been on the Hygeia, removed his hat and some other garments and dived in to help. A dinghy was launched and both men were retrieved from the water. A rumour spread that it was a publicity stunt, despite the fact that many said they did not recognise the young man who had helped. The rumour was put to rest when the rescued man wrote a letter of thanks to his rescuer a few days later in February 1910. So my last story relates to an event at Queenscliffe Pier in December 1922. A middle-aged man, clutching a bottle of beer in each hand, apparently not wanting to join the long queue to board the Weeroona, attempted to jump across the space between the pier and the paddle platform. Like the girl earlier in the other story, he missed and fell into the water. 3 men climbed down to help him from the water, and after a struggle managed to land a wet but smiling person onto the deck. To quote from the newspaper article, he turned to the crowd on the pier and triumphantly waving the bottles in the air, disappeared amid their cheers in the direction of the engine room. Where did my grandfather work on board? In the engine room. Was it him? Really, no idea, but the family historian in me likes to think so. I hope you've enjoyed the story of the magnificent bay excursion paddle steamers, the Ozone, Hygeia and the Weeroona, and also the seaside towns they visited, including a little about my grandfather, who spent more than 30 years of his life building, sailing, working and being one of the crew on the Weeroona. Thank you to Mary Lou and members of the Queenscliffe Historical Museum for the invitation to share the story with you today, and to the Queenscliffe Maritime Museum for the loan of the little gem, and to Judy and Robert Idle in particular for sharing the wonderful photo of their ozone from their personal collection. So thank you, I hope you enjoyed it, and it was a romantic time of life, and I wish I'd been there.